Hey everyone, here to give you guys a lecture on the Prelude to War. So we'll be focusing on Chapter 7, pages 122 to 133. Most of you guys got this in class, but there were a couple classes where I didn't quite finish, so I wanted to have this online for you guys to kind of access this. So let's go ahead and get started real quick and talk about why the American Revolution kind of happens. So hopefully you've done your reading. And your book talks about several things that bring about the American Revolution. Okay, two of the things on this page that I think are pretty important is number one, there was a political party in Great Britain called the Whigs. Okay, and they were incredibly fearful of the government taking away any of their liberties or any of their rights. And I think one of the reasons they were so kind of freakish about this is because throughout English history, slowly but surely the people were able to slowly take away the power of the king. Okay, and so because it had taken so long to get these powers away from the king, the British weren't really willing to kind of give those liberties up. And I think the colonists, for the most part, kind of adopted this kind of belief that liberties were very hard won. They were God given, and so any threat to those liberties, no matter really how small those threats were, it was really not going to be tolerated, and they would put a big stink about that. The other big, I think, reason that the revolution's kind of inevitable is just the vast distance between the British and the 13 colonies. I mean, we're talking about a boat ride that takes 2 to 3 months perhaps to get across the Atlantic, and then also to get messages back back to Great Britain, or the British, excuse me. I mean that's 4 to 6 months to kind of communicate back and forth, and so just the inability to communicate effectively is going to make it really hard for the British to, I guess, administer their colonies. Okay, and it only makes sense that the colonies will become more independent throughout time. They'll be used to running their own affairs, and they're probably going to have a bit of an issue if an island 3 months away is going to try to kind of tell them what to do. Okay. Um, we also know that the economic system that the British employed during this time also kind of pushed the Americans closer to basically revolution, and then this system is called mercantilism. And basically, mercantilism is an economic system in which a nation strives for self-sufficiency. And back during this time, 17th, 18th centuries, European nations wanted to be self-sufficient. And one of the ways to do that was to have colonies that could supply you with all the raw materials that you need. Okay? Now, clearly, if you look at our country today, there's no way we could be self-sufficient. We don't have, we don't have enough oil, for instance. A lot of the foods that Americans love really can't be grown in the continental U.S. So foods like bananas or kiwis or other more exotic fruits and vegetables really don't grow very well here, and we have to rely on other countries to grow them for us. Okay, so I mean back then the idea was that colonies would provide raw materials, and in return the colonies would then buy the finished goods from the mother country. So raw materials were given, and also the mother country had a market for their products. Okay, and I think most studies would suggest that the Americans basically bought 25 to 33% of all British goods. Okay, so that was the 13 colonies were a very important part of the British economy. All right. Mercantilism also basically stated that you couldn't trade with other countries, and so there were navigation laws put into place that basically blocked other nations out from trading with the colonies. All right. So if you look at some of the effects of mercantilism, number one is we see a currency shortage. Oops, it's not a very good underline there. We see a pretty big trade imbalance. I'm starting out, and that's primarily because the colonies are selling raw materials, which are for the most part pretty cheap, and then in return they are buying the finished product. Okay, and so there's a pretty big trade imbalance, which means the wealth of the colonies, all the gold and silver, is constantly kind of flowing out, and there's less and less of this gold and silver, as time progresses. Okay, which basically creates kind of a problem for the colonists. They have to issue paper currency which suffers just massive levels of inflation. Um, so like for instance, like a loaf of bread would cost like $500. I'm just kind of making those numbers up, but that kind of gives you an idea of kind of what inflation is. It gets to the point where many colonists have to rely on bartering, which is basically like just trading goods and services for other goods and services, which is a pretty basic economic system. All right. The other negative effects of mercantilism is it stunts industry. The colonists were pretty much discouraged from having any sort of industry. Okay, their job was to basically supply raw materials and uh, and then buy those British goods, and so they weren't really expected to have their own textile industry or other things like making fancy furniture and stuff like that. Like that was stuff the British expected themselves to make. Okay. Also, any laws that mess with mercantilism were nullified, which annoyed the colonists. Okay, there were some positive effects though. Southern tobacco planters had a monopoly. Um, the laws weren't really that strictly enforced, so it's kind of like if your parents have a curfew of like 8 o'clock, that might really stink. But if they don't enforce it, and you can roll in at midnight or 1 in the morning, who really cares, right? New England benefited because of their ability to build ships and the fact that they had lots of lumber, whereas the British really didn't have many forests left. Um, and also, the colonies were protected by the strongest navy and army in the world, so that was obviously a huge advantage as well. So basically, let's kind of get to the chronological order of how this kind of goes down. Um, it basically starts with the French and Indian War. The French-Indian War is the battle for supremacy in North America. We know the British win, okay? But what they also win is a huge debt, okay? So they have to find a way to pay for it. And so the British, led by Prime Minister Grenville, basically decide that it makes complete sense for the colonies to pay for their own defense, okay? So there's a series of acts put in place, and they're all kind of boom, 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 boom. We're talking like 1763 to 1765. All these things are quickly put into place, and it's an attempt to raise revenue, for the British to kind of administer their colonies in North America. All right, so some of the big ones, um, the navigation laws, basically are an attempt to stop smuggling and increase tax revenue. The Proclamation Act is meant to avoid any more conflicts with the Native Americans west of the Appalachian Mountains. There's a tax on sugar. There's a Quartering Act, so the colonists had to provide food and shelter for the British troops in the colonies. Okay, which seems very reasonable. You're gonna have a free military, just feed them and shelter them. Um, and that didn't go well with the colonists. And I guess the one that really angers the colonists, the one that gets the most heat, is the Stamp Act. Okay, which requires the use of like official paper on any kind of official business. So you'd have to pay a tax every time you do something like that, you kind of use that official paper. But anyways, the colonists hate this. They're very against the Stamp Act. Philosophically, they basically argue that it's no tax. They basically sorry, they argue that there should be no taxation without representation. Okay, so because there's no American colonists in the British Parliament, the British really have no right to tax them because they have no say. Um, they have no say in their taxes. Okay, the British would argue that there is virtual representation in which all British politicians represent all British subjects, but the Americans really don't buy into that argument. Okay, the ironic thing is that the colonists really didn't want to be part of Parliament anyways, because most of them knew that they would be a minority if they were part of Parliament, and then they would just have the taxes shoved down their throat anyways. So basically, they kind of wanted to be left out of Parliament, but on the same hand, didn't want to pay their taxes either. Okay, so it's kind of, I guess, ironic and kind of silly. Um, Resistance to the Stamp Act is pretty fierce. There are several things that kind of go down um, in terms of resisting the Stamp Act. There's two really big things the colonists do that are pretty successful in getting to the repeal of the Stamp Act. Okay, number one is boycotts or non-importation agreements. The colonists basically stop buying British goods, and that has a very drastic effect on the British because the colonies are such a big market for British goods, and so the British actually experience a fair amount of unemployment as a result of colonial boycotts, especially in the textile industry, like making clothes and stuff like that. Also, there's good old-fashioned violence and intimidation being used by the colonists, led by Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty. They basically intimidate British officials. They tar and feather them to the point where tax collectors stop collecting taxes because they're kind of freaked out. All right. So between these two things, the Stamp Act is essentially repealed by the British Parliament because it's so unpopular in the colonies and it's ineffective and it's creating unemployment and it's just not working. But in the same breath, they also passed the Declaratory Act, which states that they're going to repeal the Stamp Act, but they still have the right to tax the colonies. All right. So, anyways, fast forward a couple of years, we have a new prime minister named Charles Townshend, and basically he's going to try these taxes again. And so he taxes glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Once again, trying to raise revenue for the administration of the British colonies. Okay, specifically paying for judges and governors. So, anyways, once again, the Americans, led by pretty much the Bostonians, are just angry about this. Once again, they don't want to pay taxes without representation, and so they start smuggling tea into the colonies. Okay, and it becomes so widespread that the British are like, dude, law and order is like breaking down, and so the British feel they have to kind of lay the law down and kind of make the colonists obey the laws of Parliament. And so troops are sent to Boston, and this really angers the people in Boston. They are insulted by this. They feel it's a threat to their liberty. And so basically, there's conflict between these troops, and there's a lot of friction between these troops and the crowds in Boston. And it all kind of culminates in this event called the Boston Massacre, where British troops actually fired into a crowd, killing or wounding 11 people, including Crispus Attucks, an African American. It's unclear how the massacre happened in terms of who really kind of started it and kind of made the violence happen. There are many reports that the mob or the crowd basically were egging on the troops to fire on them and were kind of attacking them. They were throwing things at them. Some of the troops were clubbed, and so it's very unclear like what the specifics are. What's not unclear, I should say, is that the effect the Boston Massacre has. The colonies are outraged by what happens. Okay, and eventually repeal these Townshend Acts. Okay, so they repeal almost all the acts with the exception of the tax on tea. And this slide kind of shows you just the really bad policy the Townshend Acts were. It only raised 295 pounds, which is the currency, not the weight. They raised 295 pounds in 1 year, while the British costs for administering the colonies in that 1 year were 170,000 pounds. So basically a horrible policy for the British. It angers the colonies, and it doesn't even raise any money for them. So anyways, the Townshend Acts kind of culminate in the Boston Tea Party. Once again, there still is that kind of tax on tea. And the British government tries to help out a struggling British company called the British East India Company. They have all this tea, and they're bankrupt, and they need markets for it. And so they're basically given a monopoly on this tea. And so all these ships come to the colonies to sell all this tea. Okay, and the Americans are angry because even though the tea is really cheap, it's actually cheaper than tea they could smuggle into the country. The Americans feel like they're being tricked into paying taxes, and they don't want to be tricked into paying taxes. They think that them having to pay taxes is wrong and a threat to their liberty, and so all the colonies resist basically buying this tea. And in pretty much all the colonies, the ships just turn around and go home because they know it's not going to happen. But in Boston, the ship owners and the British officials are really stubborn. They're like, no, you are going to buy this tea. And so about 100-ish Bostonians basically dress up like Indians, board the ships, and dump the tea into the harbor. Okay, and this has a huge effect. I mean, this is really kind of the turning point here, where the British are like, this is unacceptable. This is going to go down here. And they passed what are known in in the colonies as the Untitled Acts in 1774. The port of Boston is closed down, which is just a huge threat. Um, Not a huge threat, excuse me, a huge blow to the people of Boston. It's like the biggest port in the colonies, and people have their livelihoods there. More troops are sent to Boston. The Quartering Act forces Bostonians to lodge British troops, sometimes even in their own house. Okay, so I mean, it is a big deal. All right, and here's where many people in Massachusetts and New England um, really start to view the British as being incredibly hostile and being like a foreign army in their own land. And they really start to see threats to their liberty. Okay, and so by 1774, 1775, the New Englanders start to kind of get ready for fighting. They start training their militias. They start stockpiling more weapons, and the stage is kind of set for that one spark. We have the incredibly angry New Englanders, and you have all these British troops trying to lay down law and order, and New England is not interested in being told what to do. And so you're going to see that the spark is going to come pretty quick after these intolerable acts. Alrighty? So anyways, I hope this helped.